The United States and North Korea are old foes, mainly because Washington is South Korea's ally, and the Koreas are technically still at war because their conflict in the 1950s ended in a truce. Now, President Donald Trump is the new American contender in the ring. He's up against the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who's been beefing up his arsenal. This week, he once again tested the waters. Pyongyang launched a new ballistic missile with enough range to hit South Korea or Japan. It flew 500 kilometers and landed in the Sea of Japan. Experts say it's a game changer. The Pukguksong-2 used solid fuel instead of liquid, which is easier to transport and faster to deploy. It can also travel off-road, making its route harder for satellites to detect. New proof that North Korea has successfully advanced its technology, despite several failed launches last year. On January 1st, Kim Jong-un declared his country was on the verge of testing an intercontinental ballistic missile that could potentially reach Hawaii. The United States is set to go ahead with plans to position an anti-missile system called THAAD in South Korea. But China and some in South Korea worry the move might stoke tensions in the region. For now, UN sanctions have been the West's main weapon against Pyongyang's ambitions, including a block on the country's coal exports. North Korea says any actions against its missile program violate its right to self-defense. What Trump does next may dictate how dangerous this nuclear standoff becomes, though so far North Korea seems determined to press ahead. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
To discuss this, I'm joined now by Tristan Webb in Seoul. He's a former North Korea research analyst for the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office and now writes for NK Pro, a website of North Korean news and analysis. And from Boston, Sung-Yoon Lee. He's a Kim Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Tristan, let's start with you. Should we be worried after this latest test?
Well, yes, the test is a violation of the UN Security Council resolutions against North Korea and is a clear indication that North Korea is willing to continue developing its nuclear-capable missiles. This was not an intercontinental ballistic missile, but it has demonstrated some of the technologies that it needs to demonstrate an ICBM, which could threaten the mainland of the US. So we should expect further tests in the near future.
Professor Lee, are they sending a message? And if they are, who's it to? And what is the message?
The primary audience or target, if you will, is the United States, North Korea's greatest foe, greatest adversary. The United States and its allies tend to patronize North Korea, look down on North Korea, with North Korea's several nuclear tests. Americans said the yield is puny, it's not very serious. With every North Korea's failed spectacular failures in missile tests, and there were several just last year, we say, oh, North Korea is 5 years, 10 years away from attaining that capability of combining a nuclear warhead with a long-range ballistic missile. We don't take the North Korea threat seriously. That's been the pattern for the past 25 years. And the reality is that North Korea is making steady progress and is one step closer to achieving that capability, that lethal capability. So this is quite serious.
Tristan, the UN Security Council has been talking, it's been condemning the situation. Has all of this just proved that the UN Security Council and the sanctions can't really do anything, and the North Koreans can test a missile whenever the hell they want to?
Yes, I think the fundamental problem with the Security Council approach is that these missiles are fundamental. They're of fundamental importance to the Pyongyang leadership. They stake their survival on having a credible nuclear deterrent against the US, and they will stop at nothing to get it. And this was admitted by the US Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, last year, that fundamentally, at this stage, North Korea is not willing to give up its nuclear program or its ballistic missile program, no matter what. 20 years ago, perhaps 10 years ago, it was a different matter. But for now, I don't see how continued sanctions by the UN Security Council or any other regional player can be effective in denuclearizing North Korea.
Professor Lee, just a few hours ago, I got news, I was going through the news, and it appears that Kim Jong-un has had his brother killed, assassinated in Malaysia. Details still a bit sketchy. I wonder, when you think about his personality, when you think of the fact that he executed his uncle as well, and now he's conducting tests, is Kim Jong-un a man who can be negotiated with?
In a conventional sense, no. Only when Kim Jong-un faces the specter of his own demise, regime extinction, can we expect Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons, the one panacea, as he sees it, that can overturn all these conventional gloomy indices of state inferiority vis-a-vis that other Korean state across the border, South Korea, that is wealthy and free, more prosperous and pleasant. The latest news is a telling snapshot of the nature of the regime. The regime operates, behaves like a giant criminal syndicate. So killing off your own stepbrother, your uncle, your closest aides, and some 340 or so of Kim Jong-un's closest aides have been purged, killed over the past 5 years. That's how the regime operates, and nuclear weapons and missiles are the non-negotiable guarantor of North Korea's regime preservation. That's how they see it.
Tristan, how does all of this square with the fact that by some accounts, and I guess I can add my experience to one of those accounts, North Korea seems to be opening up a little bit. I ran in the Pyongyang marathon, made a little documentary. Of course, this was very stage managed and so on, but there seemed to be this feeling that these guys are ready to open up a little bit. But then on the other hand, you have them being increasingly reckless and threatening the United States and South Korea. How do the two square?
Well, on the one hand, North Korea wants to guarantee its survival. And next month, the US and South Korea are going to have very large military exercises aimed at contingency situations in North Korea, where they would occupy North Korea and change the leadership. So in that sense, it remains absolutely committed to further developing nuclear and ballistic missiles. But on the other hand, you're absolutely right. I think there are small indications that North Korea definitely does want to open up on its own terms. And it will not call it reforms, because it has said it will never reform, but it does make adjustments. And it's just announced a new 5-year economic plan, which is the first time it's felt capable enough to oversee an economic plan since the 1980s. And part of that economic plan seems to involve a greater role for the internal market within the socialist apparatus. So opening up within the economy is something that we can slowly see more of. Sanctions will, of course, limit the extent to which that can take place with anybody other than China and, to a small extent, Russia. But yes, the intent is there. And I do think Kim Jong-un is someone that would be very willing to enter into negotiations if South Korea or President Trump made the overture.
Talking about President Trump, so Professor Lee, Trump initially seemed quite understated on North Korea, but then very recently he said, obviously North Korea is a big, big problem and we will deal with that very strongly. Is that an indication that he's going to take a hawkish stance on North Korea?
It remains to be seen, but I don't think it pays to be emotional and to be verbose with every North Korean provocation. Over the past 20 years or more, the popular refrain emanating from Washington, D.C. and Beijing and Tokyo and Seoul and on occasion Moscow has been, this is unacceptable, it's a serious provocation, there will be serious consequences for North Korea. There has never been any kind of serious consequence for North Korea because sanctions, although tough on the book, in terms of UN sanctions or even US unilateral sanctions, they have never been uniformly applied and sustained against North Korea. So the signs of change in North Korea under Kim Jong-un over the 5 years that you spoke of, and there are many, new amusement parks and a luxury ski resort and dolphinarium and cinemas and so forth, those are, yes, some signs of positive change perhaps, but I think the real measure of real change would be, for example, would North Korea dismantle the horrific gulags? Will North Korea increase consumption, allow people to engage in market activities? Would North Korea trade with its neighbors in the ways that other normal nations of the world do? So we don't see any signs of that real change happening at this moment.
Tristan, very finally, China, does it still hold all the cards? Is it still the only country left that can put any significant pressure on the North Koreans?
Yes, China is the country that can put the most pressure on North Korea, but I do not think that North Korea would change as much as people hope it might if China did apply that pressure. And furthermore, I think there is very, very little chance of China agreeing to US demands to apply such pressure. Significantly, last month, China published a white paper on foreign policy in the region, and the language it used in opposing North Korea's nuclear programs was significantly less than the language it used in opposing US and South Korean efforts to establish THAAD, this new anti-missile defense structure in South Korea.
Okay, I'm going to have to end it at that point because we are out of time. But Tristan Webb and Professor Sung-Yoon Lee, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.